Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Commercial Awareness Compass, your weekly guide to thinking like a commercial lawyer. Each week, we explore a key issue shaping the legal and business landscape, helping you build the clarity and confidence to discuss it, whether you're in an interview, a vacation scheme, or advising a client. This week, we're looking at Adidas's decision to raise retail prices in the US after a wave of new American tariffs on goods imported from countries like Vietnam and Indonesia increased its cost by around 200 million euros. The company's shares dropped sharply, with nearly half of its products made in those regions. Adidas is now passing those costs onto US consumers. But behind the headline lies a deeper legal story, one involving international trade rules, supply chain risk, and a contract clause that can make or break a client's ability to respond when rules suddenly change. So this week, we're asking, what do these new US tariffs mean for global brands? And how can lawyers help clients manage the legal and commercial fallout? So my name is Daniel Shepherd. I'm a future trainee solicitor and a law conversion student. And today I'm joined by Henry. How are we doing today, Henry?
Yeah, not too bad, mate. Not too bad.
Good stuff.
On this story.
Yeah, there's a lot to dig into. But before we start, would you like to give us a bit about your background and what you do?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Henry. I am a now 6-year qualified lawyer. I focus on sort of commercial contracts, data protection, all of that fun stuff. Really interested in tech and AI. And I also make content on the internet and do a lot of public speaking.
Lovely stuff. Well, kind of tariffs have kind of dominated global trade news. So this is going to be a really nice story to get into, to get the specifics of how one large company is dealing with this, that kind of can replicate how a lot of other large companies are also dealing with this. So to start off with the basics, what's happened? What are these tariffs and why do they matter to commercial lawyers?
Yeah, for sure. So this tariffs more generally have been quite, as you kind of mentioned, hot topic in the business news for quite some time since Donald Trump has come into power and his administration has stepped in, which has resulted in the markets kind of being quite volatile in a sense that 1 minute tariffs are being slapped on one country, 1 minute they're being removed, 1 minute they're up, 1 minute they're down. And I think we're going to see this continuing over the course of the Trump administration. And yeah, as you kindly mentioned, Adidas recently announced not too long back that it is going to have to raise the prices that the end consumers pay as a result of the US tariffs being slapped onto certain Asian manufacturing points that they use as their suppliers. So they kind of had to shift this burden to the American consumers. And I think it is going to be really interesting to see how other retailers, manufacturers kind of follow suit, whether or not this burden has pushed on to consumers more generally. And then I think if we take a step back again, which is when we're considering commercial awareness topics, we just want to keep asking ourselves, so what does that mean? I think it may be interesting to see when the consumers then start having to pick up the bill, whether or not that is going to shift like political opinions within the US more generally. Is there going to be a shift in attitudes? Or alternatively, which we'll come on to this later in the intermediate and advanced stages, whether or not retailers like Adidas, for example, then just decide actually we're going to just shift our suppliers or our manufacturers from these Asian countries to the US, where actually maybe the tariffs aren't as high because the consumers won't stop, or they do stop buying the things at this increased price because they can't afford it because of everything else going on in the world. This means that cost of living is more expensive. Can we afford to pay this increased hike? But I do think we can come on to this actually. It's probably quite important to kind of understand what a tariff is. And we should probably talk about that now before we go into the later stages actually. But yeah, as I mentioned, tariffs have been in the media for quite a bit since Trump has come into power. And what Trump has done is he has imposed quite high tariffs on a lot of imported goods that are imported from outside of the US, in a way to kind of protect US industries, and in turn try and reduce the US trade deficit. But this has in turn led to retaliatory tariffs from other countries. This has resulted in price increases, and it's basically just caused a lot of tension, and it's impacted quite a lot of sectors, particularly in the sort of the farm and the manufacturing industries.
I think what's quite interesting to note as well is, because obviously there is a lot of confusion around this, when a tariff is imposed, it's the importer that's paying the tariff as
Yes.
opposed to the exporter. So for
Yes.
an American company, they would be the ones that are paying that charge, as opposed to, let's say, a company in Indonesia that's exporting that.
So for the most part, you're completely right that when it's being imported, sorry, it will be Adidas that is being hit by these tariffs, because they're using the suppliers in these certain Asian countries where the tariffs have been slapped on and increased quite a lot. So when they're manufactured out in Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and then are shipped into or imported into the US, that's when Adidas get hit with a fee. That fee being a tariff, they then have to foot that bill. That bill has increased because the tariffs have increased. This means their cost of operation has gone up. They've probably done their financial mapping and they cannot continue to keep just absorbing that cost. That cost then gets shunted to us, well, the US versions of us, where they then have to pick up that cost.
Well, it's quite interesting as well. So Adidas said that it will raise prices for the US consumers, but when that happened, their shares dropped significantly. How do tariff changes like this impact global businesses from a commercial perspective?
I think we've seen quite a lot in the media around the volatility of these tariffs. Retaliatory tariffs from certain countries saying, well, if Trump's going to slap a tariff on us, we're going to slap a tariff back on you. And then we get into these tariff wars. And I think ultimately the outcome of this is that it's going to increase costs. So then if we focus, let's keep this on Adidas as the example, that if they then shift their manufacturing to the US, is that actually more cost efficient? What's the cost of manufacturing in the US? A lot of organizations use manufacturing in Asia because it's cheaper. How does that kind of balance out? And these are just commercial decisions that organizations will be needing to make. But of course, Adidas is quite a large, like, multinational company. It does have a lot of cash, so it can foot the bill for a lot longer than sort of smaller companies, which is something that they will definitely be keeping in mind.
So to round out the beginner section, what kind of support do legal teams provide when financial markets react so sharply to trade policy shifts?
I think in terms of, if we just keep this sort of at the basic level, it's kind of understanding what the markets are looking like and focusing on the sectors that firms may have that are more heavily impacted by these. And as we mentioned, these are sort of manufacturing, farming, probably automotive as well, but I guess that sits with the manufacturing industry. So clients in those sectors will be needing to have their lawyers kind of understand what's going on, being kind of ahead of the game, knowing actually this is going to impact them. And then that's when we kind of get onto looking at like the long-term strategic planning. What are we going to do? Are we going to change our suppliers? Because we obviously can't just change the supplier overnight. We've got these huge contracts in place. And then we start kind of mapping and planning for that.
So we'll move to the intermediate section and kind of go on to the specifics of advising clients. So kind of one of the big things around for the role of a lawyer is making sure that when a contract is drafted, there needs to be clauses in place for international suppliers and distribution agreements. How should tariffs be dealt with within such contracts? And are there any particular clauses that clients should be reviewing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think supplier contracts are if, let's just say Adidas say, oh, do you know what, actually, I think we might have to change suppliers, they'll be looking at their contracts to see what provisions are in this, what operative provisions do we have to say, how can we terminate this contract if we wanted to? What are our options? Does this fall within the force majeure? That is, for example, when there is, well, it's kind of described as an act of God, which says something outside of our control has happened. We can no longer perform X, Y, and Z. We can now terminate the contract if this cannot be resolved. We need to see if it's going to affect the pricing, is it going to affect risk allocation? Risk allocation is where the risk lies in certain contracts. I think we also need to consider if we are going to shift suppliers from, let's say, a supplier in Vietnam to in another Asian country, or just a supplier more generally, actually, is doing our due diligence in terms of those suppliers, checking that they meet our criteria, checking that they're compliant with any modern slavery requirements, checking that they are compliant, with any other sort of obligations that we want our suppliers to have on them.
And I guess kind of when sourcing patterns change, so as you mentioned, like modern slavery, and you've also got like ESG compliance and custom classifications, they become a lot more important when you're changing suppliers and you're trying to find new markets.
Yes, absolutely. And say, for example, we have a law firm who is looking to advise a UK company who is sourcing certain goods from, like Adidas, for example. They want to stock and sell their goods, or other multinationals. What we should be doing is reviewing their supply due diligence practices, and again, making sure that they are compliant with ESG, modern slavery, and any other risks and concerns that we have, because of course we have obligations, we have legislation around that. So we need to make sure that those contracts do that. And this is often done by sort of background checking or asking the supplier to provide like X, Y, and Z on their supply chain.
So even though obviously these tariffs are being imposed by the US, there are implications for UK and EU businesses as well. As we've mentioned with Adidas, I believe they're German. So what are the implications for those companies when they're also dealing with intermediaries or when they're involved in parallel exports?
Yeah, for sure. So there will be regulatory advice that lawyers here in the UK need to be giving to their clients, that may be UK based or otherwise, trying to primarily UK based, actually, if they're importing from regions that are affected. And as you mentioned, if we've got UK businesses that are involved in parallel exports or acting as intermediaries, then what we need to be doing is giving advice on sort of UK and EU classifications on this, and how any sort of price increases can affect VAT or import duty calculations, which is one of the taxes that we have to pay here on products in the UK.
So when Adidas is raising their prices, it can obviously bring consumer law into play. They're the ones that are going to be, I mean, as we said, the consumers are the ones that are going to be footed this bill. What kind of legal considerations apply around price increases, transparency, and customer communication?
Yeah, again, this is primarily affecting consumers in the US. It remains to be seen whether or not price hikes will also hit other markets, UK, EU, for example. But I'm going to assume you could probably hedge a bet that there'll be a marginal increase in costs due to operational costs in the US. But speaking specifically in the US, and not as a US lawyer, but if Adidas does raise its US retail prices, there may be legal scrutiny, there may be potential litigation around these price hikes. So lawyers might need to be involved in preparing appropriate guidance and communications and disclaimers to end users, to the customers, so that they are aware of this. Because of course, we always need to keep in mind sort of brand reputation, and how they're perceived. And ultimately, I think it's not going to be long until we see either some kind of change in the tariffs approach, because we can't keep having this volatile market where every other day Trump is saying, have a tariff, you have a tariff, tariffs for everybody.
The Oprah of tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. It's not great for the market. And I don't think we're seeing a huge shift in companies saying, oh, what the heck, let's just move our supply chain to the US. So I think that's something that we might see more of. I think we're going to have a lot more in the media around the tariffs. I think we're going to have a lot more from Trump and the like, but I think he's got a lot going on at the moment himself.
He's got a lot of golf to play.
He's got a lot of golf to play. And yeah, I just think that we will see a lot of change. And I think this is a really interesting commercial awareness topic, because whilst it's primarily heavily impacting the US, one, there are a lot of US firms that those watching may be applying to here in the UK, but also because a lot of firms here have US-based clients. So that will be, they'll be requiring certain support, certain levels, certain understandings of what their markets look like, and how those clients that are operating in the US, how that may impact them in the UK, Europe, and other markets, and sort of getting ready for that and being on the front foot to say, this is coming in the pipeline, or this is happening. And again, particularly in those sectors that are heavily impacted by the tariff regime.
Now, if we move to the advanced section, kind of look at the long-term picture, do you think that the volatility of the tariffs, as we've previously mentioned, is kind of the reason that a lot of companies have been quite slow to either be, maybe slow is not the right word, but they've been hesitant to move their operations to the US, or make a big decision to decide to stay with one manufacturer? Or a lot of companies are kind of in a position of waiting to see when things stabilize somewhat.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're completely right on the waiting side of things, because of course, changing a supplier for a huge organization is going to be disruptive in some capacity. It's not going to be an overnight thing. It's going to be quite a big change to move your suppliers to a different area where there may be lesser tariffs. And I think moving to the US, suppliers to the US has a whole host of issues, one of which being financial, and kind of looking at that. Is there actually the right supplier? What does this look like in terms of operational sort of activities and risk? But I think one thing with as you mentioned, the volatility of the market and how this tariff disruption is kind of still ongoing and will remain to be ongoing, I feel, for quite some time, is that clients should be being advised to sort of diversify their supply chains, and not be heavily reliant on just certain ones, because if one area gets hit with a tariff, you can just push manufacturing to another. But my limited knowledge of manufacturing, a lot of organizations use different plants for different products or different parts of the business in terms of what needs to be manufactured and supplied. So I don't think it's necessarily an easy, let's just move to this supplier. A lot of work goes into that, a lot of DD, a lot of research, and a lot of cost. But I think that's something clients should be being advised to be looking at, is considering whether or not they're going to diversify their supply chain.
So quite a lot of the big story around this is around pricing or supply shocks.
Yeah.
But from the company's perspective, what kind of scenario planning or litigation preparedness should legal teams be helping with?
I think so. We've considered a lot of this from Adidas perspective. But of course, if a supplier also has a contract in place with the organization it's providing to, if suddenly organization says, oh, this is quite a big tariff, we can't keep affording to foot this import bill, and there's a lot of changes, we're moving suppliers. You can't just up and do that because there's a contract in place. There may be a breach of contract. There may be some provisions in the contract that says you're going to stay with us for X, Y, and Z. There's a whole host of heavily negotiated clauses. So legal teams like Adidas's will be looking through to see what operative provisions we can use to get out of this should we wish to do so. But similarly, suppliers, those that are doing manufacturing, which is then being imported, may bring litigation. They may bring a claim to say you cannot terminate this contract, or they may seek certain redress and relief as a result of demand shifts, increased costs, and various other factors. So I think that's something that organizations like Adidas need to be mindful of.
Definitely. Obviously, we mentioned it from the start that the reason for this is kind of what's it, Trump administration kind of proposal, not proposal. They've put it in place.
Yeah.
So there is a governance angle here.
Yeah.
How should legal teams help boards manage geopolitical and trade risk? And are there any specific things firms should build into risk registers or internal audits?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of geopolitical risks at the moment that are kind of going on. We've got the trade tensions, the tariff wars. We've got ongoing wars that are also sadly still continuing to take place, which impact the markets and the volatility of the markets. And I think particularly on the trade tariff side of things, what lawyers can be doing is kind of incorporating this into their kind of governance in risk registers, their internal audits, what things are looking like, so that this is something that is actively tracked, so they're aware of actually this is what this is looking like, we're ready. And again, it's the classic case of it's better to be proactive and start assessing these risks. We can advise on sort of how we navigate these spaces, what we could look to do, how we could look to restructure this in advance of these events sort of repeatedly occurring, and then having to be reactive to it.
So should companies think about long-term strategies as well? So kind of diversification and restructuring?
On something like this, it's more around diversification of potential supply chains, rather than I would say there's more of a focus on diversifying supply chains, particularly in the tariff front. But also, if we are going to start looking at other suppliers, again, we need to be doing our due diligence, our background checks on sort of the labor laws within those specific regions, customs, contracts, getting those in place, and any implications of having a supplier in a new jurisdiction.
So kind of to round out this story, because obviously it is such a huge thing, so many different companies are going to be dealing with it, and there's kind of so many different factors at play. Where do you see suppliers like Adidas kind of turning to? Do you think that they will start turning to companies with lower tariffs involved? Do you think they may be tempted to move supply side to the US? Or do you think that they're, as we mentioned earlier, kind of hold and wait to see what happens to see if anything does stabilize?
Yeah, I mean, at the time of recording this, I haven't seen anything around what Adidas are going to do in terms of their suppliers, but I think it's going to be a huge decision for these organizations to be making in where they shift, or if they do consider shifting their suppliers. But as we've seen, like short term, we're probably just going to see consumers hit with the increased costs until markets may be stable, or maybe there are other tariffs that are perhaps reduced. So yeah, I think it's quite difficult to say right now what they're going to do. And again, that's our role as lawyers and commercial advisors, to be sitting with the various teams, the finance teams, the legal teams, the regulatory teams, a whole host of different teams that all be working together to put this strategy
Yeah, I guess that's kind of the big picture for the lawyers in this situation, is strategy planning for all of the different scenarios that can kind of come up, so that when, let's say, tariffs get reduced or they end up at 150%, regardless of what happens, they've got 10 different routes that they can go down and a very clear structure rather than just being in panic mode.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree.
And for those listening, before the price hikes get in, if you want to buy Adidas clothing, get it in before you get footed the bill. Though we aren't sponsored by them. What's that? Sorry.
And especially if you're in the US.
Yes, exactly. Do you know, that felt like the perfect time to have a promo code, but we'll see how sponsorship goes. But no, it will be a very, very interesting story to keep up with, and also, as I say, any takeaways that you can have from this will apply to other multinational corporations that work in similar areas, whether, as you said earlier, manufacturing with cars, whether it's kind of goods, services, agriculture. Like, there's so many different places that this can apply to, and it's going to be very interesting to look at, and it's very interesting to kind of note how companies of different sizes are going to be able to deal with this. As you said earlier, Adidas has got enough cash as it is that they can foot the bill for a certain amount of time to kind of take a moment to take a breather and then decide what to do. Whereas for companies that maybe are smaller or are struggling, their approaches are going to be far different because they need to act very quickly.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So thank you for joining this week's Commercial Awareness Compass. Thank you for joining, and remember, being commercially aware isn't just about following headlines. It's about understanding how these developments reshape the legal questions clients are asking and how law firms can help answer them. Whether you're just starting out or learning to think like a commercial advisor, always ask, how does this impact clients, and what can a law firm do to help? We'll see you next week to keep building your commercial awareness. And until then, prepare without the panic. Thank you.